For 20 years, 73-year-old Margaret Walsh watched her life slip away as crushing fatigue stole everything she loved: her energy, her passions, her very presence in her granddaughter's life. While doctors dismissed her suffering with tests that showed nothing wrong, the real antagonist wasn't a person, but the medical establishment's inability to see beyond their charts, leaving Margaret and countless other seniors trapped in bodies that had given up, resigned to fade away forgotten. But when her desperate daughter left a simple bottle of green powder on the counter with a note that read, "Just once," Margaret discovered something that would transform not just her own existence, but spark a revolution throughout her entire community. Listen to how this grandmother's shocking resurrection from 2 decades of exhaustion proved that sometimes hope realized is worth more than medical proof, and why her story of reclaimed life left even her skeptical doctor speechless. Margaret Walsh sat at her kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning, her arthritic fingers wrapped around a small glass filled with amber-colored liquid. At 73 years old, even lifting her arms to brush her silver hair had become an ordeal that left her breathless and trembling. The fatigue wasn't just tiredness. It was a weight that had settled into her bones 2 decades ago and refused to leave. It started subtly, a little slower, getting up in the morning, needing afternoon rests, declining evening invitations. But over the years, it had grown into an invisible monster that consumed her energy, her joy, her very essence. Margaret's gaze drifted to the small amber bottle on the counter. Sarah, her youngest daughter, had left it there last night with a handwritten note propped against the salt shaker. "Mom, please try this. Just once." 20 years ago, Margaret had been a different woman. She remembered teaching 6-year-old Emma to bake chocolate chip cookies at this very counter, their hands covered in butter, laughing until their sides hurt. She remembered spinning across the dance floor at her son Michael's wedding, her feet barely touching the ground. She remembered Saturday mornings at the community garden, her hands deep in rich soil, planting tomatoes alongside her neighbors. Now those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Getting out of bed required a carefully orchestrated series of movements: rolling to her side, pushing up with her arms, sitting for several minutes to let the dizziness pass. The journey from bedroom to bathroom felt like scaling a mountain. By the time she made it to the kitchen, she was already exhausted enough to need a rest. Dr. Morrison had been patient and thorough. Over the years, Margaret had undergone countless blood tests, sleep studies, cardiac workups, thyroid panels. She'd tried vitamin B12 injections that left bruises on her arms. She'd swallowed iron supplements that upset her stomach. Nothing worked. The test results always came back normal, which somehow made it worse. The exhaustion had stolen her life in tiny increments. The grandmother who'd promised Emma they'd go to Disneyland together couldn't walk through a grocery store without sitting down. The mother who'd never missed a family gathering now declined every invitation. The woman who'd once volunteered at 3 organizations now spent most days in her armchair, staring at the television without really watching. Margaret reached for the supplement bottle, turning it slowly in her weathered hands. The label was simple: a plain white background with green lettering advertising a powdered drink mix made from some plant extract she'd never heard of. Sarah had found it through an online health forum for seniors. If Margaret was honest, she'd tried everything over the years: coenzyme Q10, ashwagandha root powder, a magnetic therapy mat that now collected dust in her closet, ginseng capsules, rhodiola extract, special vitamin combinations. Each time she'd felt a flutter of hope, and each time, after weeks or months of faithful use, nothing changed. The disappointments had accumulated like stones in her chest. With each failed remedy, a little more hope had leaked away, until finally she'd stopped hoping altogether. This was just how her life would be now. But last night had been different. Sarah had come over after work, ostensibly to drop off groceries, but Margaret knew something was troubling her. They'd sat at the same kitchen table, Sarah's hands fidgeting with her coffee mug, her eyes red-rimmed. "Mom," Sarah had said, her voice cracking, "I need you to try something for me." Margaret had felt a familiar weariness. Not another miracle cure, she'd thought. But then she'd looked into Sarah's eyes and seen something that made her breath catch. This wasn't just hope. This was desperation mixed with something fierce and unshakable, a belief so profound it bordered on certainty. "I can't watch you disappear like this anymore," Sarah had whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Every time I visit, there's less of you. It's like you're fading away piece by piece. Please, Mom, what do we have to lose? Margaret unscrewed the cap with shaking fingers. The powder inside was deep green, almost emerald, with a faint herbal scent. Following the directions, she measured out 2 scoops and dumped them into her glass of water. Her hands trembled as she stirred. The powder dissolved reluctantly, turning the clear water murky and uninviting. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. Here she was, a woman who'd survived raising 3 children alone after Robert's sudden passing, who'd worked 2 jobs to put them through school, who'd faced down a serious health scare 15 years ago with nothing but stubborn determination, and she was afraid of a glass of green water. She lifted the glass and drank it down in 3 large gulps. The flavor was bitter and earthy, like chewing grass clippings mixed with medicinal herbs, leaving an aftertaste that made her grimace. Margaret set down the empty glass and waited. Some part of her half expected to feel a surge of energy, a sudden lifting of that heavy blanket of exhaustion. Of course, nothing happened. The bone-deep exhaustion remained exactly as it had been. Her arms still felt heavy. Her legs ached with that constant, dull throb. The fog in her mind persisted unchanged. The next morning arrived with the same crushing fatigue. Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her hand reached for her pill organizer, but her gaze fell on the green powder bottle. Sarah had pleaded with her, "Promise me you'll try it for at least a week." 1 day down, 6 more to go. Margaret mixed the powder and drank it mechanically. The days blurred together. Tuesday felt like Monday felt like Wednesday. The exhaustion remained unchanged. On the 4th morning, something made her pause halfway down the hallway. She'd made it from her bedroom to the bathroom without stopping to rest. For years, that journey had required at least 1 break. But this morning, she'd simply walked the distance without thinking about it. Probably just a good day, she told herself. It didn't mean anything. But that night, she stayed awake until 9 o'clock late for someone who usually fell asleep in her chair by 7. And when she went to bed, she fell asleep quickly and deeply. On day 5, she woke and realized she'd slept through the entire night. The exhaustion was still there, but it felt lighter, like a heavy quilt she might actually be able to push aside. Day 6 brought another small miracle. Margaret made it to the kitchen and ate breakfast standing up at the counter, without holding on to anything for support, without her legs shaking. By the morning of day 7, Margaret woke before her alarm and knew something fundamental had shifted. She opened her eyes and her mind was clear, actually clear, not foggy or clouded. It was as though someone had wiped away years of grime from a window, letting in clean, bright light. She sat up in bed. Not the careful, calculated movement she'd perfected over years of weakness. She just sat up smoothly and naturally. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, tears streaming down her face. Her hands weren't trembling. Her legs felt strong. Her mind felt sharp and present. She walked to the kitchen, each step steady and sure. She stood at the stove and began making pancakes from scratch. She measured flour and sugar, cracked eggs with steady hands, whisked the batter. The simple domesticity of it made her cry. She was cooking. Something that had become impossible was suddenly possible again. The front door opened. "Mom, I brought you some groceries," Sarah called out. Sarah walked into the kitchen and stopped abruptly. The spatula slipped from Margaret's hands and clattered to the floor. "Mom?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You're cooking?" Margaret turned from the stove and their eyes met. She watched her daughter's face transform as she took in the sight. Her mother standing upright, eyes bright and focused, movements confident. This wasn't the exhausted shell Sarah had been visiting for years. This was her mother, really and truly. "I feel alive, baby," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "For the first time in 20 years, I actually feel alive." Sarah's grocery bags hit the floor. She crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around her mother, holding on as though Margaret might disappear. They stood there together, both crying, while morning sunlight poured through the window and illuminated everything it touched. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. Within 2 weeks of starting the green drink, Margaret found herself standing at the entrance to Riverside Community Garden on a bright Saturday morning, a feeling of nervous anticipation fluttering in her chest. The last time she'd been here was 4 years ago, when she'd tearfully told the garden coordinator that she simply couldn't continue anymore. Now, as she pushed open the familiar wooden gate, The scent of fresh earth and growing things washed over her. Her hands, those same hands that had trembled holding a coffee cup just weeks ago, felt strong and capable as she gripped her gardening tools. She knelt beside the raised bed that had once been hers and began pulling weeds with steady, confident movements. "Margaret, is that really you?" She looked up to see Dorothy Chen standing a few feet away, her weathered face frozen in complete astonishment. Dorothy had been Margaret's gardening partner for years before the fatigue had forced her to quit. They'd shared countless Saturday mornings together, talking about their grandchildren while their hands worked the soil. Dorothy moved closer, her eyes scanning Margaret from head to toe as if searching for evidence of a trick. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, you look 20 years younger. Your eyes are clear. You're standing straight. You're actually gardening." Margaret sat back on her heels, dirt streaking her gardening gloves, and felt a smile spread across her face. "I found something that helped, a green drink powder that Sarah discovered online. I didn't believe it would work either, Dorothy. I'd tried everything else." She expected skepticism, that polite but distant expression people get when they think you've fallen for some scheme. Instead, Dorothy's entire body seemed to lean forward, her face transforming with an intensity Margaret hadn't seen in years. It was the expression of someone drowning who'd just spotted a lifeboat. "Tell me everything," Dorothy said, kneeling beside Margaret with an urgency that made her forget about the tomato plants she'd been checking. "My daughter Linda, you remember her. She's been so tired lately. She's only 50 years old, Margaret, but she can barely keep up with her own kids. She falls asleep on the couch every evening by 7. She's missed so many of Tommy's baseball games because she just doesn't have the energy. The doctors can't find anything wrong with her, but I can see it in her eyes. That same emptiness I saw in yours." Dorothy's voice cracked on the last words, and Margaret understood immediately. This wasn't just concern. This was a mother watching her child suffer and feeling helpless to stop it. Margaret knew that particular flavor of pain all too well from watching Sarah's face over the years. Margaret pulled off her gloves and took Dorothy's hands in hers. "Let me tell you exactly what I did," she said. "And Dorothy, I know how this sounds, but I promise you this was real for me." Word spread through the senior community with the speed and intensity of wildfire in dry grass. By the following week, Margaret found herself surrounded by people at the community center, all wanting to hear her story. She stood in front of a room full of elderly faces, some hopeful, some skeptical, all of them tired, and told them about her journey from complete exhaustion to renewed vitality. She shared her story at the weekly church service, standing at the pulpit where announcements were made. She talked about it in the checkout line at the grocery store when Mrs. Rodriguez asked why she looked so different. She mentioned it to the postal worker who'd noticed she was walking to the mailbox instead of waiting for delivery. Each time she told the story, she saw the same reaction, that desperate spark of hope in eyes that had grown dim with resignation. Margaret became an accidental evangelist for this simple green powder, though she never intended to be one. She wasn't trying to convert anyone or sell anything. She simply couldn't keep quiet about something that had given her back her life. And as the weeks passed, she began to witness transformations that mirrored her own. Dorothy's daughter Linda started the green drink on a Monday morning, mixing it with the same skepticism and desperate hope that Margaret had felt. Within 3 weeks, Linda was standing on the sidelines of her son's soccer field, not sitting in the bleachers or watching from the car, but actually standing for the entire game. By week 6, she'd volunteered to be the assistant coach, running drills with 8-year-olds and organizing snack schedules with an energy she hadn't felt in years. Mr. Patterson, the elderly widower who lived 3 houses down from Margaret, had become something of a neighborhood ghost. After his wife passed away 3 years ago, he'd stopped leaving his house except for absolutely necessary errands. But one morning, Margaret was walking past his house and stopped in her tracks. There was Mr. Patterson, standing on his front porch in actual outdoor clothes instead of his usual house robe, holding a leash. And at the end of that leash was Copper, his golden retriever who'd spent the last 3 years confined to the backyard. Mr. Patterson caught Margaret's eye and gave her a small, almost embarrassed wave. "Heard about your green drink from Dorothy," he called out. "Figured I had nothing to lose. Copper deserves better than a backyard." The stories multiplied. Mrs. Kim from the library started volunteering for story time again after 2 years of being too tired to commit. Robert Santos returned to his woodworking hobby and started making toys for his grandchildren. Jennifer Marshall, who was only in her 50s but had been fighting exhaustion for a decade, rejoined her book club and actually stayed awake for the discussions. But not everyone celebrated these transformations. 3 months after Margaret's revival began, she received a phone call from Dr. Harrison's office requesting she come in for a follow-up appointment. She sat in the familiar examination room, looking at the same anatomical posters she'd memorized over 15 years of visits. Dr. Harrison entered with his usual professional demeanor, but his expression was harder than she remembered. He sat down on his rolling stool and looked at her with concern mixed with something that looked almost like disappointment. "Margaret," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I've been hearing about this supplement you've been promoting throughout the community. I've had multiple patients mention it, and I need to talk to you about this." Margaret felt her defenses rising. "I'm not promoting anything, doctor. People ask me what changed, and I tell them the truth." "The truth," Dr. Harrison repeated, leaning forward. "Margaret, you need to understand something crucial. Anecdotal evidence, one person's experience, or even a dozen people's experiences, isn't medical proof. What you're experiencing could be a placebo effect. You're getting people's hopes up for something that might be nothing more than their minds convincing their bodies they feel better." His words landed like small, sharp stones. Margaret had trusted this man for 15 years. She'd sat in the same room countless times, listening to his recommendations, taking his prescriptions, following his advice. And yet nothing he'd offered had given her back what this simple green powder had restored. "With all due respect, doctor," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm, "I don't care if it's a placebo effect. Do you understand what I'm saying? I genuinely don't care about the mechanism. I care about the results." Dr. Harrison started to interrupt, but Margaret held up her hand. "2 weeks ago, I danced with my granddaughter at her school dance for 2 hours straight. Last Saturday, I baked 3 dozen cookies for the church bake sale. I stood in my kitchen for 4 hours and never once needed to sit down. Yesterday, I worked in my garden for the entire afternoon. I can live my life again. Isn't that what medicine is supposed to do?" Dr. Harrison's expression softened slightly. "Margaret, I can see the change in you. It's obvious and remarkable. But as your doctor, I have a responsibility to warn you about the risks. We don't know the long-term effects of this supplement. We don't know if this improvement is sustainable. And you're vulnerable, Margaret. You and all these other seniors who are desperate for a solution." Margaret understood his concern was genuine, but she couldn't help feeling he'd missed the point entirely. "Doctor, I spent 20 years being careful, 20 years following medical advice, being patient and reasonable. I took every supplement you recommended. I tried every therapy, and I spent those 20 years slowly dying. This drink has given me something no doctor could." Hope realized. 3 months after that first reluctant sip, Margaret stood in her kitchen teaching Emma how to make her grandmother's famous apple pie. The recipe had been passed down through 3 generations, and Margaret had feared it would die with her. Emma, now 16, worked beside her at the counter. They'd been at it for an hour peeling and slicing apples, mixing cinnamon and sugar, rolling out the butter crust. But Emma kept glancing at her sideways, these quick, furtive looks when she thought Margaret wasn't paying attention. Finally, as she crimped the edges of the pie crust, Emma's hands stilled. "You know," she said softly, not looking up, "I thought I'd lost you." Margaret's own hands paused. Emma continued, her voice thick with emotion. "For years, since I was maybe 12, I thought my real grandma was gone. There was just this tired, sad person in her place. Someone who looked like my grandma but wasn't really her. Not the grandma who used to play hide and seek with me until we were both laughing so hard we couldn't run." A tear dropped onto the pie crust. Emma wiped at her face with the back of her floury hand. "I used to come visit you, and you'd be asleep in your chair, and I'd just sit there watching you, trying to remember what you were like before. Mom would tell me stories about all the things you used to do, and it felt like she was talking about someone who'd passed away." Margaret's throat tightened painfully. She'd been so consumed by her own suffering that she hadn't fully grasped how her decline had affected everyone who loved her. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Margaret managed. "I never wanted—" "No, Grandma." Emma looked up, tears streaming down her face, but her expression wasn't grief. It was wonder. "You don't understand. I got you back. I actually got you back. Do you know how rare that is? Most people lose someone and never get a second chance." She squeezed Margaret's hand hard. "Most people watch their grandparents fade and disappear, and that's just how it goes. But I got you back. You're teaching me to make pie. You're here, really here. Do you know what a gift that is? Margaret pulled Emma into a fierce hug, both of them crying, getting flour and tears on each other. When Emma finally left that evening, carefully carrying her perfectly golden pie, Margaret felt something settle in her chest, a profound gratitude that transcended words. That night, as the last light faded from the sky, Margaret sat in her garden on the wooden bench. The tomatoes she'd planted 6 weeks ago were starting to ripen. The roses she'd thought she'd never have the strength to tend again were blooming in brilliant colors. Her body, which had felt like a prison for so long, now felt like home again. She thought about Dr. Harrison's warnings, about the uncertainty of long-term effects, about the possibility that this could all be temporary, and she realized she didn't care. Even if the fatigue returned tomorrow, she'd had these 3 months. She'd baked with Emma. She'd planted tomatoes and watched them grow. She'd felt the soil between her fingers again. 20 years of exhaustion had taught her something valuable. Life wasn't measured in years or even in health. It was measured in moments of genuine living. Whether this green drink was a miracle or just a temporary reprieve, it had given her back those moments. "Mom?" Sarah stood at the edge of the garden, concerned. "Are you okay?" Margaret looked at her daughter, this woman who'd refused to give up on her, even when she'd given up on herself. She stood from the bench with ease and took Sarah's hand. "I'm better than okay, honey," Margaret said, her voice steady and sure. "I'm grateful.